And welcome to the Olive Branch Community Church. It is so good to have you here today. I am Kathy, and we warmly welcome you, especially if you are new. We meet on Sundays at 10 o'clock in person, so if you ever want to check us out in real life, we would love it. And I hope that you would come and introduce yourself to us, and we would love to meet you. Connect with us online, Facebook, Instagram, Spotify. We have a podcast there, also a worship playlist that you can take with you wherever you go. We would just love for you to connect with us deeper. Today, Pastor Ken, he finishes up the Indivisible series. It has been amazing and oh so timely. As you can see, the world is becoming more and more fractured, and we as the church need to do our best to be peacemakers, peacekeepers. And so Pastor Ken wraps that all up today. So without much further delay, we are going to just spend some time in worship, and our hope and our prayer is that this service blesses you today.
Presence is all I need. It's all Well, we've finally reached the end of this series of talks that we've been dealing with, indivisible. In other words, setting aside your need to be right, which is huge, isn't it? Because it involves our pride. So we've talked about a lot of different things along the way. Let me just kind of go through this. Fear is really the driver of all this stuff. It turbocharges differences and turns them into anger. And most of us have experienced something like that along the line so far. Fear and anger and frustration cause us to look for somebody to blame. It causes us to build enemies. And so we ask the question, who am I going to blame? Am I going to blame God for this? Government? Is it going to be the vaxxers or the anti-vaxxers? Am I going to blame cats? In other words, we can survive COVID, but have our relational world not survive it. And there are a lot of different factors in that. What happens is that when our pride gets in the mix someplace, the whole thing of, but I'm right. Well, if you're right and you proclaim that or do it wrong, then you're wrong. And it creates a division between me and you. So the whole point of this is to come together somehow. We have this whole thing. For some reason, we have this need to express our disapproval of people, for what they think and who they are and all this stuff. But you can't build a relational world on disapproval. What happens sometimes with people who are followers of Jesus is kind of like, well, I disapprove, and Jesus agrees with me. And I'm telling you, that stuff is relationally toxic. You can't build a world and build a relational world on top of that. So today we're going to be talking about something that I think has the potential to really help us. So we've talked about this probably from the beginning of the whole thing that we've been through with COVID. Caution, absolutely. Caution, yes. Fear, no, absolutely not. So today I want to talk about where we want to end with this, and that's respect, respecting each other. Everybody deserves respect. Respect everyone. And really, that's the difference between fear and caution. We talked about caution at the beginning. Caution, yes, God wants us to be cautious. Fear, absolutely not. Now, how many of you would agree that fear is an awful feeling? I think most of us would. Most of us have experienced it. Even the people who are really macho, they experience fear too. Most fear, and at least in the way that we experience it, is short-lived. When I was in university in a previous life, I worked at this big mansion, and it was actually an amazing place. 55 rooms, huge, big summer home for one of the guys in New York City. But it got a little bit creepy at night because it was back off the road, big driveway. You're familiar with kind of the whole mansion thing and so on. And so around 9 o'clock at night, it started to get a little bit strange. So anyways, I'm making my rounds around that time of night. What I didn't realize was that my brother had found a window that was open, broken into the mansion, and when I came walking down the steps into this great big lobby of this place, had been turned into an office building, he came running out of a side room, waving a broom and yelling at me. Now, I stood at the water fountain, which is where I was headed, for probably about, a few seconds and so on. And then I screamed my head off. Now, I knew, that was my reaction. I knew it was my brother, but I reacted anyways. So you got to love brothers, older brothers and so on. Scared me half to death. That was my reaction. Sometimes I've experienced the reaction of other people. This lady that taught me how to make fudge, Lottie Lindsay, one time I startled her. It was like with a prank thing, and I startled her, and she slapped me across the face. So I learned not to do that again. So there's this involuntary reaction that we have when we're scared. And I'm guessing that you probably have had a moment like that. You're going around a curve, there's some snow, your car starts to skid, and there's this panic, there's this feeling of panic that comes up inside. Or you find out you can't find one of your kids, they're missing. And there's this panic, this fear that comes up inside. You react to it, Or the boss says, let's go to my office. We need to talk. And so there's this fear that settles into your heart. Or you get a call from the doctor the day after the CAT scan, and there's fear that comes into your heart. Sometimes the reaction is to freeze. I was just watching a recent thing on Mayday. You know how I love that show. And this pilot, the plane had started to stall out. And so you're supposed to apparently push the thing forward and push the nose down. He pulled it back and kept pulling it back and wouldn't let it go because he froze. He knew he was trained to do differently, but he held it back, and the whole plane went over and killed everybody on board. I hope you're not flying tomorrow. But our reactions to these things in our lives can be unpredictable. When fear has no place to go, then it begins to create problems. Again, in a previous church I was in, I had a number of good friends who were Vietnam vets in that church. And the PTSD, they had been in terrifying situations. Guerrilla warfare is terrifying. And they didn't know what to do with it, and it created this awful fear where, there would be a firecracker that would go off, and they'd hide under a bench someplace. It was just, an involuntary reaction. One of the guys that I knew, was close friends with, he'd worked with the Navy SEALs, and he was apparently in the middle of a nightmare, and he woke up strangling his wife, okay? It's involuntary reaction, and it causes us to do things that can create all kinds of problems. You strangle your wife, that could create a problem, right? Now, here's my concern. We've been through 2 years of COVID. And through that whole 2 years, we've had fear pumped into our homes about the numbers going up and the numbers in other countries, and people are dying, and this person's, they're on oxygen, and just this ongoing thing that creates fear. Now, that fear is not going to just automatically dissipate once they say, okay, you can take off your mask, okay, things are going back to semi-normal, and so on. It's not going to just disappear. You have to figure out what you're going to do with it. And it can cause major relational problems with us. And that's what I want to get at today. You have to make some decisions about what you're going to do with that fear. Now, we know that fear in general creates a reaction, many times an overreaction. Long-term fear can create all kinds of other issues. If you had grandparents or great-grandparents that went through the Great Depression, you know that fear that they felt long-term of scarcity, made them, they wouldn't throw anything away. They kept stuff in their refrigerator until it grew fur on it, because of the fact that it had created this panic of not having enough. Now, let me just reaffirm something that we've been saying all along, okay? My reaction, fear is not necessarily the problem. My reaction, though, when I react, I am never the person that I want to be. I'm never the person that I hope I'll be. And this is where this gets after us spiritually. What God wants to see in our lives most is faith, not fear. It's really interesting. You watch Jesus' life, and the things that he commends, the things that he is astonished at, is either a person's faith, great faith, he's astonished, or their lack of faith. He looks at his disciples, where's your faith? He's astonished at it. In fact, I would go so far as to say that fear causes us to many times react, to reject the direction that God wants us to go in. We miss what he wants us to do. For example, most of us know that God's calling on our life is to be generous. Jesus said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. In other words, you're going to be more happy giving than you are receiving. But our world system tells us a totally different story on that. And so what many times happens to us is that when we get to that juncture in the road, we think, okay, well, I'd like to be a generous person. I think that would make me a better person. But the fear gets in the way. And the fear is, what if I don't have enough? What if I run out? What if I lose the happiness that money brings me? And so we many times, instead of going toward being the better person that we've been called to be, we then react to that, and we end up in self-obsession. We spend all of our money on ourselves. And this is in a world where people have more than they ever have. In fact, I would say that go so far as to say that fear has taken people further off track than almost anything else. Because when we're afraid, we back up, we step away from where we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to do. And that's never God's intent. Fear causes us to see threats where there are no threats. Fear causes us to see enemies where there are no enemies. Fear causes us, to make us angry when there's really no reason to be angry. Fear does a lot of damage in the very core of our lives. And so what happens is there's this downward spiral of fear that goes on. you know? So we're headed someplace, fear comes in the way, and what we hear, and this is what we're hearing a lot over the news and so on, and what we've heard for the last 2 years, be afraid. Now we have a choice at that point. We can respond to that or we can react to that. Fear causes an almost instant reaction, and that's where we have to stop it, because reaction goes to anger, anger goes to an exaggeration of the danger and how bad it is. Exaggeration goes to frustration because it stops us, and then frustration many times leads to disrespect and paralysis and eventually into divisiveness, especially in organizations. Because you see, we still need to be right even though we're afraid. Now, I want to tell you a story today, and then we're going to draw some conclusions from it, and then we'll be done. So that's kind of where we're going. And the story I'm going to tell you is from the Old Testament. And there are some of you, if you've been to church most of your life, you hear stories like this, and you think you're inclined to believe it, take it at face value. Some of you have not been to church, and so this isn't your background. So when you hear, about, God dividing a sea and people walking through on dry land, you're thinking to yourself, right, that's kind of an exaggeration of what's going on. Or when, God is at the top of a mountain, the whole thing's shaking and smoking, you're thinking, okay, well, they're trying to make their God more powerful. So there's a tendency sometimes to just kind of not accept that. Now, this story I'm going to tell you, I think, has some really powerful lessons in it. And I want to just ask you if you could just set aside some of your reservations for a few minutes, and that's something that you can deal with later. Now, to understand what's happening, you need to understand that the people, Israel, had been enslaved by Egypt for the past 430 years. So they went in there, 70 people, they grew as a nation, and over time, the people got worried about their growth and so on, enslaved them, and so on. So this is a really horrible experience. Like, this isn't like, they're asking them to bake their bread and stuff. Like, they are in hard labor, and they're beaten when they don't do what they're supposed to do. They're throwing their babies into the Nile River to kind of reduce the population. So this is really, really a tough, ugly situation. And they're calling out to God, and he hears their prayers, and he decides that he's going to set them free. Now, he had said that all along, but now is the time. So he calls Moses a leader. If you haven't seen the movie The Ten Commandments, Moses is the one who goes, confronts Pharaoh, and of course, they get out of Egypt. That's the short story. Long story is, that this was a scary journey, because, this Pharaoh, this guy is the most powerful man in the world of that day. He has the most powerful army in the world of that day. And yet, the Israelites watch as God takes them down with all these plagues. And then, when they're chasing them out of Egypt, they come to a sea and they're kind of blocked between the mountains and the sea, and God parts a way through the sea. They go through on dry land, and when Pharaoh and his chariots try to get through, well, they end up in kind of a car wash. Actually, they all die. So it's a powerful, powerful story, how God is able to release his people. And there's miraculous things happening all over the place. There's the constant visible presence of God in their camp. A pillar of fire at night, a pillar of cloud during the day. They've watched God bring water out of rocks. They've watched God, rain down food from the sky, So again, you may struggle to believe that, but that's what goes on. Now, here's what happens. They've come to the destination where God wanted them to be. God had promised that he was going to bring them into a land. He described it as flowing with milk and honey. Let me describe the imagery there. Flowing with milk meant that there was plenty of pasture land for their cows and their goats, so they would have plenty of milk. And then also there were flowering fruit trees so that, the bees would get the nectar from the flowers, and then they would produce honey. So that's kind of the imagery that they used for really, really, really good land, especially in an agricultural society. Now, the problem with the Israelites is that they have been in slavery, and they kind of have this, on-again, off-again relationship with both Moses and God. And so they believe for a while, things get bad, and immediately it's like, oh, woe are us, what are we going to do? And they get hysterical, and then God calms them down. God, works in the situation and resolves it and so on. So they've had a couple of episodes of that. They finally have arrived at kind of the Jordan River, which is the borders on the land that God has called them to go in. Now, Moses sent out 12 spies, one for each of the tribes of Israel, and sends them out to go and take a look at this land, see what's going on. You know what spies do? They go in and find out where the fortifications are and what the people are like, the lay of the land, and so on, and how they're going to take it. So the point was to find out how they're going to take the land, not figure out whether or not they're going to go into it. So they gave Moses this account. This is what it says in the book of Numbers. It says, we went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here's its fruit. And they had like some bunches of grapes. Took 2 people to carry them. So they've got this on a pole between the men and so on. So here's its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful. And the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw the descendants of Anak there. Now you have to understand, Anak was a group of people that were exceptionally large, especially big culture. If you're familiar with the story of David and Goliath, Goliath was from that culture, and the record tells us that he was about 9.5 feet tall. Gives you some idea, okay? So far so good. Rich, beautiful land. The caution in this is going to be tough. This is not going to be a walk in the park. You know, these people not going to just hand you their cities and so on and let you take over. This is going to be a difficult thing. So God has led them into that. God has, promised them something good. They're going to be there. Now there are spies. These spies there are 10 of them that are basically giving the bad side of the report. Now, there are 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, that are basically saying, so things start to stir up when they tell them, that there's all this stuff. So you can just imagine there's 2.5 million people, which is what we're guessing there were. And all of a sudden, they're worried and they're afraid, okay? So then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land. We can certainly do it. Now, I'm just guessing that he had to settle these people down because of the fact, again, that they were stirred up. And then what happens is that the other 10 spies, they decide that they're going to make things even worse. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack these people. They are stronger than we are. Now remember, they weren't sent there to figure out if they're going to do the job. They were sent there to figure out where things were so that they could actually pull it off. And then they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. Have you ever heard of a land devouring people? I haven't, okay? All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak had come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes. We're overwhelmed by this. And we look the same to them. Now, how did they know? Did they ask, how do we look to you? You look like, we feel like grasshoppers. They don't know this, but they're cultivating fear. Again, caution would say, okay, this is going to be difficult. We need to prepare ourselves for a difficult journey, okay? But all of a sudden, there's this reaction. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Okay, so they've gotten an exaggerated report, and then the exaggeration and the fear continues. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and our children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And then they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. So they've just gotten a bad report. They haven't seen the land themselves. And they're just overreacting. Fear is out of control. Now you need to understand, a lot of these people still had scars on their back from getting whipped. A lot of these people had their babies thrown into the rivers. Slavery, let's go back to slavery because this looks tough. That's not even a rational response. And they haven't even moved. And they're already in catastrophe mode, whining and crying, and grumbling and catastrophizing the whole thing. Oh, we're all going to die. There's 2.5 million people there with, 600,000 warriors. We're all going to die. And then that leads to disrespect. Disrespecting the leaders that God had put in front of them, and then disrespect for God himself. Caution says, okay, we need to be careful. Fear says, we're going to all die, our wives and our children are going to be taken as plunder. We should have died. We need to go back to Egypt. Now, this whole thing progresses, and it really becomes defiance against God, because God is the one who has taken them out of Egypt. God is the one who has preserved them all along the way. Moses and Aaron were the ones that stood, in their behalf against Pharaoh. God has proven victorious. God drowned the most powerful army on the planet, and then they get to this place here, and they haven't even seen anything, and they're scared out of their minds. But that's the way fear goes. Now, here's what I know. Caution is always good. Caution is always a good thing. Caution is part of being wise. Caution is, you need to look beneath the surface here. And that's what God had revealed to them just before this, a few weeks before this. He said, he goes through this whole thing about rashes and about skin disease and about, foods that you eat and everything. And the whole thing is be cautious. Don't just stuff something in your mouth because you think it's good to eat. Be careful when you see this stuff. They got basically some information that was like 3,000 years ahead of its time. They didn't know what germs were. But God is giving them caution and saying, this is what you need to do if you want to be in good health. Caution is always good. The whole book of Proverbs, which is a book of wisdom, it's about caution. It basically says, don't believe everything you're told. Don't be gullible, Be really careful who you marry, because it could set the course of your life, and who you go into business with and who you choose as your best friends. Make sure that money is a tool and not a god, because if you worship it, you're going the wrong direction. If you're going to be making a big decision, ask for the counsel of other people, and be careful what you post on Facebook or on TikTok or Instagram. It doesn't actually say that, but the implications are there. Be cautious when you buy something big. Make sure it's not about your ego. Make sure that you don't spend beyond what you can do. Just be careful. Don't be afraid. Don't be worried, but be cautious. Be wise. Caution is from God, but fear is not. In fact, fear is not from God. Paul told Timothy, he says, the spirit of timidity is not from God. A spirit of fear is not from God. God gives you power. God gives you love. God gives you the rationality, a sound mind, the ability to think straight and not let fear distract you. Fear ultimately leads to disrespect. You disrespect other people and you disrespect God. Ultimately, that's where it comes to. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, it's because of the fact that as we move forward, fear is very close to the surface. Fear has been pumped into our homes through the media, and through the government, and pretty much everybody who has an opinion about it. Fear is very much kind of at the surface level of our life. Now, here's the question. Is fear rational? Does fear make sense? Just watch somebody, who's afraid of spiders or snakes, get into a place where there is one. They're at least 100 times bigger than the garter snake and than the spider, but they'll jump and run. Fear is not rational. It's irrational. In other words, we react without even thinking. And without even, basically thinking about the situation that we find ourselves in. You see, fear, it's reaction that makes us the people that we really don't want to be. That turns us, causes us to do things that we really don't want to do. And I'm telling you, you do not want the future that fear will create for you. Because fear creates a reactionary future, and it creates relational messes. That's not where you want to be. Remember the equation we talked about? When people trade caution for fear, they get angry. Anger almost always comes out of this. And then frustration. And sometimes they're paralyzed. And when when we're angry and frustrated, it doesn't just stay in this neat little package inside. It comes out of us, and it affects our relational world. See, when you're filled with unspecified fear, then the point is you will probably find an enemy, even if they're not an enemy. Even if they sleep next to you every night, you will find an enemy. And that's exactly what you see in this account that's written by Moses. God, instead of being the one who had miraculously cared about them, loved them, set them free, well, he becomes the enemy who's going to take them to a place where they're all going to die. That doesn't even make sense. But that's what they're thinking. And that's why I'm saying fear is irrational. And people even get messed up more, They're thinking, let's find a leader to take us back to slavery. The point is, you need a leader to get you out of slavery, but, going back into slavery, that doesn't take any leadership at all. It happens to us too, doesn't it? When we're afraid, and then we begin to realize, and then we realize that all of our fear is holding us back, and it's causing us to do things and act in ways and say things and make decisions that are taking us in the wrong direction. But what happens is our fear keeps us from admitting it. Nobody likes to admit, I was too afraid to move ahead. I was too afraid to do what I was supposed to do. Nobody likes that. And so there's this thing that goes on in our lives, Faith, we look at, what we've seen. We've seen God work, there's a better story. That's what the Israelites had. They had a better story. They saw God work on their behalf. This was not like, 50 years old or 100 years old or 400 years old. This was just months before them. They could see the better story. But fear then, you see, becomes the story that we tell ourselves. In the end of the story, we're all going to die and so on. We catastrophize the end of it. And so this is what we know. Because of that, fear is not from God. It's not from God at all. Now, here's what I know. I know that respect is where you want to be. I know that, caution is where you want to be instead of fear. But we're coming out of a season where our homes and our hearts have been filled with fear, and we have to figure out where we're going to send it. Because it has to go someplace. It's not going to just disappear, when you want it to disappear. Now, I know this, we all wear, and deal with our fear differently, okay? Some of you coming out of this, you're going to be basically thinking to yourself, man, oh man, finally, get rid of my mask. I'm sick of this, and I'm ready to move on, ready to move into the future, so let's just be done with this once and for all. That's where some of you are going to be. But others of you are going to be way over and more on the conservative side. And you'll be thinking, what? You mean after all this mess, after all the government, they're just going to open the floodgates again, and they're going to spread this disease again, and we're all going to get sick and so on. You're going to tend to catastrophize. And the problem comes not in how we process the information. It's not in how we process it and how we think about it. It's how we think about people. And sometimes the disrespect that causes. See, our minds, when they're afraid, can be thinking along the lines of, how could someone be so dumb and so careless, to not agree with me and my fears? And so here's the deal. God gives us the freedom to think and to respond and to be afraid or to be unafraid as we want to be. He gives us space and time. And that's what we need to give each other. That's the respectful thing to do. When the nation of Israel, was offered land and homes and pastures, and a place of their own, they were all free to be as cautious as they wanted to be. What they were not free to do is rebel against God and rebel against, Moses and Aaron, and basically say, we're not going to go in. We're going to go back to Egypt. What they found out was they couldn't go back to Egypt. And so then they had this emergency response, well, we're going to go in anyways, and just all this stuff, and it created more chaos, and they ended up wandering in the desert for the next 40 years. And I'm telling you, that's where fear will send you. You will wonder if you don't go to where you need to be and the place that God has prepared for you to be able to be there. We need to respect God. Jesus said that we are to love God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our strength, and with all of our mind. You know what that means? It means trusting Him. It's faith. Trusting that God is who He says He is, that He loves us like He says He's going to love us, and He's going to take care of us, and that He's working on our behalf. It's faith. It's faith, and it's what God calls us to. Faith means trusting God. Not just believing in God, it means trusting God. He tells us to be cautious, and He tells us, fear isn't for me. So if you're feeling fear, you need to know that it didn't come from me. That He's infinitely good. That He's at work, that He controls all the events of the world. That, that life is not just some big crapshoot, where we're not sure how it's all going to turn out. No, we know, because He controls the future. So love God. Love God. Trust Him. against all the fears and all the doubts that come into your mind. Our second calling is to love others as we love ourselves. Jesus, put it as simply as possible. He said, do for other people like you would want them to do for you. And I'm telling you, nobody likes disrespect. Nobody likes to be dumped on. Nobody likes to have somebody who's angry, yelling in their face or anything like that. Nobody likes that. And so what this basically says is love God, put him first, trust him, and then don't just treat other people like you feel like treating them because they're not agreeing with you. See, love isn't a feeling. Love is not this wonderful feeling that you have for all these people, because after all, they're human beings and so on. It's actually how you treat people. It's actually how you treat people. It says this when it talks about love. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 13. He says, love is patient. Love is kind. It doesn't envy. Does not boast. It's not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. See, fear will cause you to seek, look out for yourself. Who gives a rip about anybody else? Keeps no record of wrongs. So this is where we need to be. This is what God has called us to. This is the future that God has called us to be a part of. Now I want to say this, and this is really important to understand. We are not just here randomly on this planet. Just kind of do whatever we feel like doing, and hopefully it turns out well, and hopefully, we have, good RSPs, and we'll be able to survive till we die. That's not God's plan for us. God still has a mission. We are part of that mission of making this world right again. That's what God, and I'm telling you, you can't do that sitting in your home, eating snacks and watching TV. We have to, again, and it takes some time for some of us to be able to come out of the cocoon that we're in, but we have to re-engage in life and in the world. Years ago, the olive branch went through a tough era. It mainly had to do with fear over money. Okay, that's basically what it was, and not having enough, and, most churches have been there before. Now, here's the deal about that, okay? God has always provided for us as a church. God has met every need that we have. When this building became available, we didn't have the money to buy it. It took, we had about 2.5 weeks to raise $2 million in cash, and then we still had to pay for it, and we had to renovate it, and so on. This was a challenge. This challenged everybody's faith. But God provided. God gave us what we need. He's always provided. But I'll tell you, when you get into, a sticky situation, all of a sudden, all of the faith, all of the things that you've seen God do kind of goes out the window. And so, we, after a particularly gnarly, annual general meeting, we came to an agreement. And that agreement was everyone deserves respect. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect. And what we came out of that with was we will respect everyone always. We even had signs made, and we all put them in our lawn because we were entering into an era of disrespect. And we just needed to say that, okay? And it's biblical, okay? Peter says, respect everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Respect the king. And just kind of to affirm this, who does it tell us to respect? Everybody. Respect everybody. Respect everyone. Love the family of believers. Love other people who belong to you. You don't go in and just take them apart and, dissect them and nail them to the floor because you don't like what they say or what they do. We're called to love. Love, Jesus defined that. We love one another as he has loved us. That's the calling. Now notice what it says. It says, fear God. If you're going to fear someone, fear God. And this isn't like hiding in a corner, and shaking and being afraid he's going to turn you into, blow you up or something like that. Fearing God basically means to respect him. Respect the way he's called you to live. Respect what he says about caution. Respect what he says about moving forward. Treating him with respect. And it says, respect the king. And you have to understand, this is talking about Nero. Nero basically was the emperor back in that day, and he was the one that had Peter nailed to a cross upside down. But Peter says, no, you got to respect the people who are in leadership. Fear is intended for God in the sense of respecting who he is and respecting what he's called us to do. Because you see, anything else, any other kind of fear will lead you astray. And this is kind of the way it works, okay? Love is intended for action. When we're called to love other people, that always means action. And Jesus kind of defined that. He says, if, I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. It always involves action, not feelings that you have inside. So love leads to action. When it doesn't go to action, then, and it gets diverted into fear, which is what happens, then that fear ultimately leads to reaction, which means that you get stuck when you react because you're afraid to move forward, and that leads to apathy. You need to understand that the opposite of love is not hate, it's apathy. And then you end up with a new mission, and the new mission is to survive till I die. That is a mission that you can accomplish because just about everybody does. I haven't met anybody yet who didn't survive till they died. That becomes your mission in life. And I'm telling you, that is not worthy of the one and only life that you have here. We are called to serve and to love God. If you're struggling with fear and maybe a little bit of paralysis, and gradually getting out and being with people again, I want to suggest some medicine. First of all, take your time. God always gives us space and grace. But the medicine I'm talking about isn't, tranquilizer or a shot of whiskey or anything like that. It's important for you to recognize who God is on a daily basis. And I don't know if you do that or not. Because if you recognize God on a daily basis, then that gets reflected in how Jesus described him, where Jesus basically said, he is so for us. He said, I created you, you were made in my image, and I fully intend to have you as part of my full-time family. You are already part of my family. You are already my son. You are already my daughter. That's not something that's going to happen when you die. And you're going to be part of my home forever. And it starts now. I have the hairs of your head numbered. I know your name. I know your personality. I know where you react. I know what you're afraid of. Just recognize me for who I am. And I just want to challenge you. It's part of the homework here. Just take time every day to remember who God is, to remember that he's your Father in heaven, that he loves you irrationally. And then just bring out your fears to him. Whatever you're afraid of, just be honest about it. You don't have to be macho. God is not impressed, when we come and we pretend we're just fine. Just tell him what you're afraid of. Bring it out before him. But it's important that you do that with thanksgiving. The Bible says, the passage in Philippians basically says, present all your requests to God with thanksgiving. And what that means is, God, I believe you're going to do something about this, that I'm not just stuck here with my fear, to die on this planet unrecognized without accomplishing my mission. I believe in you. This is the day that you've made, and I will rejoice and be glad. Why don't you try that? See, this is like daily vitamins. This is like daily exercise. If you don't exercise faith, it gets flabby, and gets sick. You have to exercise it. Why don't you try this? Today, I want to simply leave you with 10 commitments that respect makes. See, we made a commitment as a church 5 years ago, because disrespect is so destructive that we are going to live by these and we're going to hold ourselves to them. And I would encourage you to be a part of that. Let me just go down through them. Respectful people see others as image bearers of God. And that means you can't just treat them any way you want to. Respectful people learn how to differ with other people without demonizing them, without turning them into enemies. Respectful people believe the best about people. Believes the best about people. Respectful people give others a chance to talk without interrupting them or without, dominating the conversation. Respectful people don't use inflammatory words or phrases. Respectful people are courteous and kind to everyone. Everyone deserves that. Respectful people do not stereotype people, not classify them, based on their age or their race or their gender or their culture or their religion. Respectful people know how to say things like, you know what, I could be wrong. They know how to say things like, I am wrong, would you forgive me? They know how to apologize quickly. Respectful people form opinions about issues and people not based on fear, not based on anger. but with great care. They take great care in the opinions that they form. And respectful people honor the time and the effort of others. They're prompt and they're faithful. And I want to encourage you, all of us, to commit ourselves to whatever the future holds. See, you're going to face some situations, and your fear is going to cause you to want to react. And I'll tell you how that happens. You've heard me say this before, but everybody comes to a fire, and they have a bucket of gas in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. And when you're done, everybody knows which one you threw. I tell you, fear right now is this flammable thing, and we have to deal with it. And so the point is, let's respond and not react. Let's respect and not disrespect. Let's make things better and not worse. Everybody comes to a fire with a bucket of water and a bucket of gas, and when you're done, everybody knows which one you threw, because it's either better or worse. What I'd like us to do in closing is make this commitment together. I make a fresh commitment today before God and His church to let go of my fear and respect everyone always. I make a fresh commitment to God today to let go of my fear and to respect everyone always. I am committed to respect everyone because that's what God has called me to do it. Let's pray. God, we're small people. Little virus can take us out. Stepping the wrong way off the sidewalk can take us out. We're vulnerable, we're fragile, but you are not. And you are the one who cares for us. You are the one who watches over our lives. You're the one who's called us to be cautious, but told us that fear doesn't come from you. Help us to believe you. Help us to trust you. And help us to live with the faith that you are able to fill our hearts with. In Jesus' name, amen. We're going to spend some time singing, worshiping together, and then we're going to come back, and I'm going to send you off.
Death is defeated.
Joshua, one of the men who came back with a good report and urged everybody to go ahead, he said, be of good courage. Be of good courage. Don't be afraid, because God is with you. And I would pass those words on to you today as a blessing. Don't be afraid. Be of good courage, for God is with you, and he will never leave your side. Amen.